Welcome to Process Group Pentagon. This is where we will explore the 5 process groups, which, by the way, are talked about in the PMBOK Guide 7th edition. You also have the 5 process groups mentioned on PMI's Standards Plus portal, so they haven't gone away. In addition to this, also be aware that the concept of knowledge areas has not gone away either. They are still both relevant to your understanding of project management. So let's talk about the 10 knowledge areas first. We have integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholder. Now, if you're still trying to get your arms around this, just think about a mnemonic. There's a mnemonic that goes, I saw 6 chipmunks quietly roasting coffee, reading poetry stories. Now that you've got an idea of the knowledge areas and what exactly the knowledge areas are, which I'm hoping you've read up, the next thing is to understand how these interrelate. So, very quick, let's talk about each one. Integration is combining all the moving parts of the project together. In fact, the entire project. Scope is all about scoping out what needs to be done. Schedule is understanding the sequence and the timeline for activities on the project. Cost is about understanding how much activities will cost and the overall budget for the project. Quality is about fitness for use, conformance to requirements, and customer satisfaction. Resources is all about human resources and then physical resources and materials, human, equipment, materials, supplies, facilities. Communications is all about communicating a message to the audience, to the stakeholders, understanding what needs to be communicated, why and when. Procurement is all about understanding what needs to be purchased from outside the firm and going ahead to put some contracts in place with vendors or sellers to provide that, and then managing that whole endeavor. And then stakeholders are people who the project could affect, people who could be affected by the project. And it's our job as project managers to ensure that these folks are adequately engaged, keeping them in the loop, and making sure they're satisfied. So, taking a look at this, we can look at the interactions of these knowledge areas. And that's what we're going to be doing for some of today, taking a look at the knowledge area interaction. But in addition to this, I want you to think about all of these as a system. These are all in a system. And that system of knowledge areas within the project is surrounded by containers called process groups. So we have containers, knowledge areas that contain processes, right? And those are contained in a wider bucket, which we call process groups. So I want you to think about these being contained in different buckets, and these buckets span across initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. Now, when you understand that these are just buckets, right, you identify which of these knowledge areas, processes fall into which bucket. But this is an overarching idea to help you see it's a system within a system. So you've got processes within knowledge areas, and those knowledge areas, they could be divvied up into process groups. But most importantly is the interaction between all of these components. And that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time going over today, how they interact. So let's go a little bit deeper into the interactivity of these knowledge areas and process groups. So I want you to think about it like this. I want you to see integration as giving you certain outputs. And the outputs you get from integration, they are going to help you with scope. always ask yourself, how does the preceding knowledge area affect something happening ahead? And it's very simple. The project charter is an input to plan scope management. The project charter is an input to plan schedule management and plan cost management and plan quality management and plan resource management, plan communications management, plan procurement management, plan stakeholder engagement, and even plan risk management. Those are the interactivities I want you to be thinking about when you look at this image. This is really a template for you to explore connectivity across the knowledge areas and even the process groups. Okay. So understanding how the knowledge areas interact is very important. But there are things that come from integration that go everywhere else. Okay, but let's keep focused on some of the overarching ones. Okay, so when we talk about this, I want you to think about scope, giving you the WBS, the work breakdown structure, which becomes part of the scope baseline from Create WBS. That becomes an input to define activities where we are defining our activities. And ultimately, we're going to create the schedule and some components from schedule management. They help us with costing. Some components from cost interact with quality. We have the cost of quality. So we have cost of quality, and then we have understanding the budget itself. So when you understand the budget, you understand what you can do from a quality standpoint with the budget. And when you understand cost, vice versa. What can I do with quality from a cost perspective? What am I going to do with cost from a quality perspective? So there's going to be this feedback loop as far as the cost of quality is concerned. What is the cost of quality and how much have I decided to use for the quality activities? There's going to be a feedback loop. As usual, depending on the quality, it could affect my resources, human equipment, material supplies, and facilities. And my resources, the people I'm working with, the materials I'm working with, they're going to affect quality. So I need you to think about this in a more organic, free form way as opposed to just thinking rote. There could be several interactions here, whole number of permutations. When you think about resources and communications, the humans working on the project, they are going to affect communications. And for that reason, stakeholders could also affect communications too. And communications affects how stakeholders are engaged. When you think about procurement, understand that resource management and procurements, they are interrelated. If you're planning for your resources and you realize you don't have resources in-house, then you need to think about procurement. And when they come in-house, they need to be developed. Those resources, those humans, when they come in, they also need to be led through managed team. So these are interactions to think about. And when you think about the cost, of course, cost and procurements, there's some interrelationship there. Depending on how much budget is available, you could decide to employ outside help or not. And then when you think about stakeholder and integration, you have a loop in that your stakeholders affect what you're planning, but at the same time, your project charter affects what happens in identify stakeholders. Your project charter contains a key stakeholder list, and that's an input to the very second process called plan stakeholder engagement. So, project charter goes into identify stakeholders. So, this is how I want you to think about it. Regarding risk, the question is often, okay, so what happens with risk? How should I think about risk? Well, to think about risk, all of these, in one way or another, contribute to risk. So you could have stakeholder risks, scope risks, schedule risk, cost risk, quality risks, resource risks, communication risks, and procurement risks, and also risks in your overall project management plan, your change management plan, and so on. So all of these interact in a number of ways, so many ways. And we could go on and on talking about how each one is affected by the other. We could talk about how our scope still has something to do with our stakeholders' requirements. So there's interaction and interactivity there as well. We could talk about how risk is affected by our stakeholders' risk appetite. We could talk about how resources are affected by budgets that we have. And we could talk about interactivity there. We could talk about how scope, the amount of work you want to get done, is going to somehow affect the cost and also is going to affect quality. Just understanding the scope. All right. So when it comes to these interrelationships, rather than look at them rote, try to do this. Connect every knowledge area to another in some way, just as a mental exercise. Just take random knowledge areas and say, how does this connect with this? And then think about it and study it. How does integration affect procurement? Does procurement affect integration? You could say, yes, the project charter is an input to plan procurement management. The project charter comes from integration. That's one relationship. You could say the project management plan is an input to every process except two. So it does go into procurement, to all three processes. You see, that's the level of thinking that I want you to challenge yourself to have. How do the knowledge areas interact? Higher level thinking without getting into all the tiny little minutiae that actually is almost like a waste of time when you take a look at how the exam has become in 2021. No one's really asking you deep and intricate ITTO process questions, though they are good for you to understand and know, but the emphasis has obviously changed to higher systems thinking. And this is what I want to challenge you to do. Now, when we talk about the actual process groups, you do know that typically the outputs of initiating are inputs to planning. A lot of the outputs of planning, the project management plan, for example, is an input to executing. And a lot of the data that you're getting from executing, it goes into monitoring and controlling, specifically to the monitoring and controlling process known as um, monitor and control project work. That's where all of the WPD, see, so you got WPD coming out of here, and the WPD goes into monitoring and controlling. Remember that? So we could show our WPD here, and that work performance data is going to be processed, and you're going to get work performance information. And there's going to be some sort of looping that happens in that the work performance the work performance reports that you end up getting, it goes back into a lot of places such as those in executing, but it's also important to see a loop that goes like this. You have work performance information that comes out of all of those monitoring and controlling processes, and it goes into monitor and control project work, and that is how you get WPR out. So let me make it clearer. So you have direct and manage project work. that gives you work performance data. And that work performance data, it goes into all of these monitoring and controlling processes outside of integration. And then those give work performance information that goes to monitor and control project work. And it's from here that we get work performance reports. So I did skip a few steps, but I wanted to make it more explicit. WPD becomes WPI, and then you get WPR. The bottom line is WPR goes back into a number of places, including places in executing, and very importantly, WPR goes into monitor risk as well. All right, so I want you to try your hand on drawing out this pentagon. I want you to expand your thinking by showing webs of interactivity. I want you to challenge yourself to open up the guide and have a more systems thinking approach to the content rather than getting lost in the trenches. Overarching thinking is important. How does quality relate to risk? How does schedule relate to procurement? How does communications relate to scope? And things such as that. All right. If you have any questions or brainwaves, I want you to leave them in the comments. And as soon as I'm able, I will answer your question. But I'm curious to know if you have any questions for me. Thank you very much. I wish you all the very best in your preparation for the exam. Remember, in 2021, a lot of the exam emphasis is agile. Agile is here to stay, and you really need to understand not just this approach from a predictive standpoint, but you also need to understand how knowledge areas flow fluidly and interact even in the world of agile. You also need to be able to look at pages 90 to 95 in the Agile Practice Guide. And as you're going through it, you need to be able to look at this and say, okay, there's an interrelationship between here and here in the world of Agile, or you need to be able to say, this is what integration means from an Agile perspective. This is who is responsible. It's the team. The team is responsible for the interactivity and the integration in Agile, right? As far as scope is concerned, you need to be able to identify what scoping out the project looks like. The product backlog is key. Understanding the sprint backlog. When it comes to schedule, you need to be understanding. Let's just go to the board one more time because I really want to stress the importance of these. So, integration, it's the team's responsibility. Scope, this is where we talk about the product backlog and the sprint backlog, things like that. When we talk about schedule, this is where we talk about tasks. And this is an optional thing we do in Agile, and it's done, of course, by the team. And we also need to think about the roadmap, release plans, and things like that. When we talk about cost, we need to think about more like just in time costing and costing on a case by case basis. First of all, at a really, really high level. And then as you get into the sprint, if there's need for you to do that at a lower level, you would. When we talk about quality, we talk about the inspect, adapt mechanisms in any of these agile methods you're using. Scrum, for example, we do inspect, adapt a lot. We do that in the daily Scrum. We do that in the retrospective. We do this in the sprint review. When we talk about resources, first of all, we don't want to call people resources in the world of Agile. We want to recognize them as a team. So that is a mindset that needs to change. People are people first, and then they're team members. We don't want to call them resources, but we want to think about the self-organizing team, want to think about respecting people, trusting them, believing that they're adults and giving them the autonomy and power to get the job done by making their own decisions and decentralized decision making. When it comes to communications, we want to think about face to face communication being preferred if possible, only because of the importance of body language, nonverbal cues, things like that. as opposed to email, which is a really bad way of communicating under a lot of circumstances because you're not getting the full message. Procurements, think about flexible contract arrangements. We talk about master services agreement. We talk about measuring value and having a value based type contract as opposed to milestones. And then we talk about stakeholders. You got to remember the business people and the developers. You got to work together daily throughout the project. So whether you're looking at this from an agile perspective, you're looking at this from a predictive perspective, it really doesn't change the structure. The structure is very flexible, but when you think about all of these, risk is at the center. And when you think about Scrum, for example, all of those ceremonies, they are all risk coping mechanisms. So risk is front and center in the world of Agile. When you talk about initiating, this is authorizing what needs to be done. It doesn't change in Agile. Planning, you still plan frequently, doesn't change. You execute within the sprint. You monitor and control within the sprint daily. And you conclude the sprint with your retrospective. So, however you want to spin it, this structure is rock solid, doesn't change. You can either tailor it up or tailor it down. But I'm hoping that this approach to viewing the world of project management makes it a lot easier for you. All right. Thanks for joining me. You take care. Bye for now.